everyone, to the 2025 Wilfred Owen birthday lecture. I'm pleased to welcome Elizabeth Vandiver, who is Professor Emerita of Classics at Latin and Classics and at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, and where she's joining us from this evening. She's also an honorary member of the WOA, and we're really delighted to welcome her tonight. I keep getting a little error message, excuse me. She is the author of this wonderful book. Rupert Brooke, Charles Sorley, Isaac Rosenberg, and Wilfred Owen, with Lorna Hardwick and Stephen Harrison in the Classical Connection series from OUP, and also the wonderful Stand in the Trench Achilles, where I got to know of her from her amazing work, again with OUP, and more recently, hopefully coming out fairly soon, is going to be her new book, Richard Aldington and Modernist Antiquity, Classics, Imagism, and the Great War. And we are really delighted to have her here tonight to talk to us about Owen and Uriconium. And I will just share my screen. And off you go.
All right.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jane. And thanks to all of you for being here today. I would like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Michael Longley. Anyone who reads Wilfred Owen's poetry will be struck by his visual imagination and his extraordinary ability to use focused visual images to bring the scene he describes vividly before his reader's eyes. I'm thinking of phrases such as, "Buttercups had blessed with gold their slow boots," or "the sunk fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels," or "thick green light as under a green sea," or even the single word "turfy" in "deep under turfy grass." Owen was not himself an artist, unlike Isaac Rosenberg and David Jones, both of whom were accomplished painters, but he did show a certain gift for caricature. Next image, please, Jane. Jane, can we get the next image? There, thank you. As we see in this sketch that he sent to his sister Mary, depicting an episode of vertigo he experienced. Although Wilfred was not himself an artist, he had a very keen visual sense and a fine attunement to beauty, both the beauty of the natural world, as in the examples I just gave, and more importantly for this talk, the beauty of man-made objects. He was eager to see and to appreciate great paintings and sculpture. He also had an equally keen sense of the appeal of the past, the lure of the old, which led him to admire ancient art and also to engage with other physical remnants of past cultures, such as pottery fragments and coins. His letters make it clear that whenever he was in London, he tried to fit in time for museums. He mentions visits to the National Gallery, the British Museum, the London Museum, and others. And these were not just hasty visits. In a letter to his mother of September 1911, he says that he, quote, "promenaded the National Gallery all morning," close quote. And in January 1912, he mentions the day when he spent the morning in the British Museum and the afternoon in the National Gallery. His love for beautiful material objects in general and for old objects in particular led to the interest in antique furniture that he developed in his last year, when he began buying pieces to furnish the cottage he hoped to acquire after the war, and even toyed with the idea of becoming a dealer in antiques himself. On 13 February 1918, he wrote to his mother after visiting an antique shop. Next slide, please. "There I saw in a very frowsy condition something like the perfect chair, and what's more, a filthy old chest of drawers of lovely proportions and precious oak. I think I have found what I want at last. It occurs to me that I should make a really workmanlike dealer in antiques. If I could get a shop in London and some experienced hands, I should be not uncontent. Colin might manage the business while I go foraging in Baghdad, Peru, Ceylon, Pompeii, or Market Drayton. In this, we see Wilfred's interest in old objects and his ability to recognize the value in them, even when they are currently in damaged or otherwise diminished condition. The chest of drawers is filthy, but he sees through that to its lovely proportions and precious oak. This letter also gives me a useful segue to my main topic for today, since in the list of exotic places where he would like to forage for treasures, he lists Pompeii as the culmination, before the humorous drop in tone to Market Drayton. This mention of Pompeii is indicative of Wilfred's abiding interest in Roman archaeology and the material remains of Roman culture. One of his cherished possessions, which passed to his cousin Leslie Gunston after Wilfred's death and is now in the Owen family archive at the Western Library in Oxford, was a small statuette of the god Mercury, or Hermes in Greek nomenclature. Next slide, please, Jane. It is a reproduction of a Gallo-Roman type of statue, as you can see here. The image on the right is ancient. The image on the left is Wilfred's statuette. The image on the right dates to the period of the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. It's not exactly the same presentation of Hermes as Wilfred's statue, but clearly both belong to a recognizable type, and Wilfred's little statue may well be a direct reproduction of some ancient original. Hibbard conjectured that Wilfred bought this statue in France. It's also possible that he bought it in England. We don't know. But France, of course, abounds in Roman archaeological sites. Wilfred does not mention visiting any of those in his letters, but he does recount visits to 2 Roman sites in Britain. One, Silchester, ancient Caleva Atrebatum, near Reading, which he visited while staying with his Gunston cousins, and the other at Wroxeter, ancient Uriconium or Viriconium, near Shrewsbury, to which he could bicycle. He became interested in Silchester through visiting the Reading Museum's collection of artifacts from that site. The collection of artifacts is still there, by the way, in the Reading Museum, and very much worth visiting if you're ever in Reading. A letter to his mother of 31st December 1909 gives an elated description of a visit to this museum, where the assistant curator showed him over the Silchester artifacts. And a guide to the Reading Museum's Silchester collection survives in his personal library. He visited the actual site as well, but found it disappointing. He wrote to his mother on 18 August 1910 that he was, quote, rather disappointed since the mounds have been leveled down and the pits filled up, so that the city presents the same appearance as ordinary country, except for the walls. We found nothing particular. Next slide, please. It's true that there is not much to see at Silchester itself on the ground level. These photographs of the site were taken in 2008, and you can see that to the untrained eye, the location of the city itself just appears to be a field. With handsome and friendly cows, you see me communing with one of them, but no obvious traces of the Roman city. Now, the trees in the background of these 2 images mark the walls, which are still partially extant. Next image, please. As the plan on the left shows, the city was completely walled, and one can walk on the walls, but as you can see in the right-hand image, large stretches of the walk are not particularly evocative of the Roman city. There are some sections, next image, where the walls are more impressive, as here, but the best preserved bit of the site, the amphitheater, next image, please, had not yet been excavated when Wilfred visited. This is how it looked in 2008 with my sister in it for scale. In the picture on the right, you can see how before the amphitheater was excavated, it really could easily have been mistaken for just a natural dell, declivity in the land, so it wouldn't have caught Wilfred's attention in any way. It's not surprising, in short, that he found the site of Silchester anticlimactic compared to its surviving artifacts. However, Wilfred and Leslie also visited Llewellyn Treacher, a wealthy antiquarian, amateur geologist, and local historian, who gave them a cache of artifacts from Silchester. Next image, please. This is from a letter to Susan Owen. Hearing I was interested in Roman remains, he, that is Treacher, took me round to his shed and fished out a small sack. You can have all this pottery from Silchester, he said. If you, dear mother, cannot picture to yourself my feelings. Sorry for that typo. It's my feelings, not by feelings. If you, dear mother, cannot picture to yourself my feelings and the semi-reluctance with which I took that sack, then you don't know your own son. For I knew that it contained treasures. Whether I smelt or heard or felt or tasted them, I cannot say, but I knew. Well, it turned out after Leslie carried them home on his carrier that there were almost 100 large pieces of various wares, crowds of so-called Samian, including 2 with actual potters' names on, rare treasures, and above all, just half of a superb bowl. We have divided the fragments between us and tossed up for the bowl. Leslie won. But I secured an equal amount of other stuff and a bone pin. We both have several genuine Roman nails. These items are now also in the Owen family archive in the Weston Library. The shards of Samian ware you see there on the right are not the ones that Wilfred had. I don't have a picture of those, but they show you what that form of pottery looks like, the color and so forth, the fact that sometimes it has engraved figures on it, and are probably fairly close to Wilfred's shards. So while the actual site of Silchester did not fire Owen's imagination, the partially excavated ruins of Uriconium were a different matter. Next image, please. For those of you who are interested in the history of Uriconium, its excavations, and so on, I strongly recommend the 2022 book by Roger H. White called Roxeter, Ashes Under Uricon, which I've relied on in writing this talk. I can only give a brief summary of the site's history here. Roman Uriconium or Viriconium is near the modern village of Roxeter, about 7 miles from Shrewsbury. Uriconium was, at its height, the 4th largest town in Roman Britain, and its ruins comprise one of Britain's most extensive Roman sites, although the visible remains are only a small portion of the original town. There were several excavations of the site, the first beginning in 1859 under the direction of Thomas Wright. Next image, please. This shows the most impressive part of the site, the remains of the bath complex and the imposing wall, locally known as the Old Work, as those ruins appeared during the 1859 excavation. This wall was never completely lost. It was always above ground level, and it was a popular subject for artists in the 18th and 19th centuries. White's book that I just mentioned reproduces several representations of it, including some very lovely watercolors. Here's a more recent photograph of it. Next image. And another one. Next image. With some people in it to show you the scale. Looking at this wall, it's perhaps not so surprising that Wilfred wasn't particularly impressed by the walls at Silchester. But he was intensely drawn to the site of Uriconium. His interest apparently was piqued when he was 16 by artifacts from the site in the Shrewsbury Museum. In a letter of 11 August 1909 to his mother, he mentioned seeing, quote, 2 priceless objects, end quote, probably referring to part of a column capital and fragments of a mosaic floor. His next letter to Susan, dated 19 August 1909, tells his mother that he has borrowed a bicycle and plans to visit the site itself on the following day, and a letter to his brother Colin, postmarked 21st August, confirms that he made this visit, his first to the site. At that time, the site was largely neglected, but it was open to the public, and there was a small on-site museum in a tin shed. Owen became a friend of that museum's curator and often dug in the fields at Uriconium himself, with his brother Harold accompanying him. In Harold's recollection and Journey from Obscurity, Wilfred gained a thorough knowledge of the site. I'm quoting from Harold here. Lay visitors to the site, seeing the studious-looking boy delving away so seriously, would often try and get into conversation with him. He would explain at great length anything they showed an interest in, very often ending by conducting them around the diggings. Wilfred did not come across any spectacular objects, but Harold recalled that, quote, a number of his finds were later added to museum collections, close quote, and John Stallworthy accepts that this is probably true, although Harold doesn't specify which museums. Wilfred's library contains a copy of George Fox's Guide to the Roman City of Uriconium His copy is the 1911 printing, and he was greatly struck by that book's account of the city's sudden destruction. Next image, please, Jane. According to Fox, quote, "One thing is certain, that the city and its inhabitants perished by fire and sword. Everywhere, when the earth which covers its remains is turned over, it is found to be black from the burning, and plain traces of the massacre of the citizens showed themselves when the ruins, amongst which the visitors' strays, were excavated. Skeletons of men, women, and children lay amongst the blackened walls. In their terror, some of the unhappy people had sought refuge in the hollow floors of the baths. The skeleton of an old man, near whose hand lay the little treasure he hoped to save, was discovered crouched between the pillars of the hypocaust of Chamber 5, and not far from him were also the skeletons of 2 women. The dark and narrow hiding place did not avail to save the fugitives, for the beams of the blazing roofs in their fall blocked all way of escape, and they perished, stifled by the smoke of the burning buildings." Fox's account here was based on the conclusions of the lead excavator, Thomas Wright, in the 1859 through 61 excavations. Wright gives a lurid account of the sacking and burning of the city, refers to a frightful massacre of the inhabitants, and says that a group of skeletons found in the hypocaust, that is, the underfloor heating chamber of the bath complex, were terrified citizens who had fled there to try to hide from the ruthless slaughter. So that's where Fox gets this. And Wright also reports that a heap of Roman coins were found near the skeletons, and he conjectures that as they fled, these doomed civilians tried to take their savings with them. Now, all of this is strongly evocative, but modern archaeology has shown it to be entirely inaccurate. Echoing Fox's confident opening phrase, White says, quote, "One thing is certain, there is absolutely no evidence for an attack on the town," close quote. Rather, the town's eventual desertion was due to the gradual dissolution of Roman societal organization and not the result of a sudden violent cataclysm. The supposedly abundant traces of burning that Wright reported are, White says, actually, quote, "a black humic soil characteristic of the decay of organic materials," close quote. And as for those skeletons in the hypocaust, White says that the most reasonable explanation is that these are later burials buried in the hypocaust because, as he says, quote, "it was conveniently there. All you had to do to inter a body was to break through the overlying floor." This type of reuse of Roman buildings for completely different purposes is widespread and not at all remarkable. But the narrative of pillage and burning fit into the conception of Roman Britain and the Anglo-Saxon conquest of it that was current in the 19th century when Uriconium was first excavated, and this narrative became firmly established in the descriptions of the site with which Wilfred Owen was familiar. This reinforced his perception of Uriconium as a British parallel to Pompeii, a town that met a sudden end in one catastrophic moment of disaster and was preserved intact for later archaeologists to discover. On 18 June 1911, Wilfred mentions in a letter to his mother that he has learnt that Uriconium will soon be re-excavated. These further excavations were undertaken in 1912 through 1914 under the direction of J.P. Bush Fox and were terminated at the beginning of the Great War. The work was done by local laborers and supervised by university students. Visitors were allowed to walk around the excavations for a fee. By this time, of course, Wilfred was no longer living in Shrewsbury. He was in Dunsdon from October 1911 through February 1913, and then teaching in France from September 1913 to October 1915. But we know that he did visit the ongoing excavations at least once, and perhaps more than once, in the summer of 1913. Wilfred was in Shrewsbury in early July 1913, and during this time, he revisited Uriconium and met 2 young Oxford archaeologists there. Dominic Hibbard notes that one of these 2 Oxford students was Mortimer Wheeler, who later became one of the most eminent historians of Roman art and archaeology of the 20th century. In a letter to Susan Owen, who was away from Shrewsbury at the time, dated 6 July 1913, Owen comments, "I've not been back to Uriconium again, perhaps because of those 2 Oxford blues whose colors are to me as red to a bull. He's seemingly here referring to a recent visit that Susan already knew about, since he says, I have not been back again. That implies she knows he's been there once. Wilfred had just learned at this time that he had failed his scholarship examination for the University of Reading, and it was clearly very painful for him to be confronted at a site he loved and in some sense considered his, with the contrast between these young Oxford-trained scholars and his own exclusion from the university education he so desired. Another letter from mid-August to Leslie Gunston mentions a visit to Uriconium where he, quote, met new people and by 1 o'clock had done a good day's work and pleasure, close quote. I wish we knew what he means by a good day's work there. Was he allowed to join in digging in these excavations? Unfortunately, that's all he says about that. This could refer to the same visit referred to obliquely in the letter to Susan Owen, or perhaps to a second visit. In any case, however often he visited the site in the summer of 1913, seeing it again and the current excavations apparently motivated him to write his Uriconium, an ode, a poem of 112 lines, which Stallworthy dates to this period. This ode is a meditation on the ancient city, which the poem's speaker treats both as a British equivalent to Pompeii, whose sudden destruction offers a haunting window into the everyday life of a vanished world, and as a memento mori and warning for the modern visitor. This poem gets fairly short shrift in most scholarship on Owen, as do most of his other early poems. The ode is written in a very old-fashioned style. It features abundant archaisms in syntax and vocabulary, such as hope as the past tense of help, een for even, and so on. But I think the poem deserves more attention and indeed more admiration than have generally been accorded it. I'm going to take the time to read the entire poem to you, since I presume that most of you are not deeply familiar with it. Next image, Jane. It lieth low near merry England's heart like a long-buried sin, and Englishmen forget that in its death their sires had part, and like a sin, time lays it bare again to tell of races wronged, and ancient glories suddenly overcast, and treasures flung to fire and rabble wrath. If thou hast ever longed to lift the gloomy curtain of time past, and spy the secret things that Hades hath, here, through this riven ground, take such a view. The dust that fell unnoted as a dew wrapped the dead city's face like mummy cloth. All is as was, except for worm and moth. Since Jove was worshipped under Racon's shade, or Latin phrase was writ in Shropshire stone, since Druid chants desponded in this glade, or Tuscan general called that field his own, how long ago? How long? How long since wanderers in the Stretton hills met men of shaggy hair and savage jaw, with flint and copper prong, aiming behind their dikes and thorny grills. Ah, those were days before the axe and saw. Then were the nights when this mid-forest town held breath to hear the wolves come yelping down, and ponderous bears long severn lifted paw, and nuzzling boars ran grunting through the shaw. Ah me, full 1,500 times the wheat hath risen and bowed and fallen to human hunger since those imperial days were made complete. The weary moon hath waxen old and younger these 18,000 times, without a shrine to greet her gentle ray, and other temples rose to power and pelf, and chimed centurial chimes until their very bells are worn away. While king by king lay cold on vaulted shelf, and wars closed wars, and many a Marmion fell, and dearths and plagues holp sire and son to hell, and old age stiffened many a lively elf, and many a poet's heart outdrained itself. I had forgot that so remote an age beyond the horizon of our little sight is far from us by no more spanless gauge than day and night, succeeding day and night, until I looked on thee, thou ghost of a dead city or its husk. But even as we could walk by field and hedge hence to the distant sea, so, by the road of common dawn and dusk, we travel back to history's utmost edge. Yea, when through thy old streets I took my way, and wrecked 1,000 years as yesterday, methought sage fancy wrought a sacrilege to steal from me such godly privilege. For here lie remnants from a banquet table, oysters and marrow bones and seeds of grape, the statement of whose age must sound a fable, and Samian jars, whose sheen and flawless shape look fresh from potter's mold, plasters with Roman finger marks impressed, bracelets that from the warm Italian arm might seem to be scarce cold, and spears, the same that pushed the Cymry west unblunted yet, with tools of forge and farm abandoned, as a man in sudden fear drops what he holds to help his swift career. For sudden was Rome's flight, and wild the alarm. The Saxon shock was like Vesuvius' qualm. O ye who prate of modern art and craft, mark well that Gaulish brooch and test that screw. Art's fairest buds on antique stem are graft. Under the sun is nothing wholly new. At Viracon today, the village anvil rests on Roman base, and in a garden may be seen a bower with pillars for its stay that anciently in basilic had place. The church's font is but a pagan dower, a temple's column hollowed into this. So is the glory of our artifice, our pleasure and our worship, but the flower of Roman custom and of Roman power. O ye who laugh, and living as if time meant but the 12 hours ticking round your dial, find it too short for thee. Watch the sublime, slow, epical time registers a while, which are antiquities. O ye who weep, and call all your life too long, and moan, was ever sorrow like to mine? Muse on the memories that sad sepulchral stones and ruins prolong. Here might men drink of wonder like strong wine, and feel ephemeral troubles soothed and curbed. Yet farmers, wroth to have their laws disturbed, are sooner roused for little loss to pine, than we are moved by mighty woes long sign. Above this reverend ground, what traveler checks? Yet cities such as these one time would breed apocalyptic visions of world wrecks. Let Saxon men return to them and heed. They slew and burnt, but after prized what Rome had given away out of her strength and her prosperity. Have they yet learnt the precious truth distilled from Rome's decay? Ruins on England's heart press heavily, for Rome hath left us more than walls and words, and better yet shall leave, and more than herds or land or gold gave the Celts to us in fee, in blood, which makes poets sing and prophets see. Before I turn to discussing the poem's content, I want to say a few things briefly about its form. Granting that the vocabulary and syntax are drenched in 19th century poetic archaisms, if we look at the ode as an ode of indication, if we look at the ode as an indication of Wilfred's skill in handling form, both metrical and stanzaic, I think it is a very impressive demonstration of how well he had trained himself as a poet. And remember, he was only 20 when he wrote this. No matter how unlike more modern forms of poetry it may be, it is extremely skillfully written. In it, Wilfred exhibits an impressive control of meter and a great facility for rhyme, as well as extraordinarily effective scene painting, which allows him to bring visual scenes vividly before our eyes. All of these aspects of the poem, obviously, would be crucial to his later effectiveness as a war poet. Next image, please, Jane. The poem consists of 8 stanzas, each of 14 lines, with the rhyme pattern A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E, F, F, E, E. I've marked the rhymes in the central stanza describing the Roman remnants. So you see, if you look down the right-hand side there, we have the rhymes table, fable, grape shape, mold, cold, impressed, west, arm, farm, alarm, qualm, and fear, career. Now, I assume that in Wilfred's pronunciation, the ARM and ALM endings were much closer than they are in my pronunciation with my strong American R sound. When I read it, arm and qualm, don't rhyme, but in Owen's pronunciation, they probably did, or close enough to it. The metrical pattern, like the rhyme pattern, is intricate. The poem is in iambic meter, with most lines being full pentameters, that is, with 10 or 11 syllables each, interspersed with short fifth and eighth lines. These usually have 6 syllables, but in the last stanza they have only 4. They slew and burnt, have they yet learnt? And notice that each of those 4 syllables is a monosyllable, which slows the line down and makes it more impressive, I think. In the use of lines of different length and in the complicated rhyme schemes, Owen is clearly demonstrating how carefully he had studied both Keats and Wordsworth. His skill in using iambic meter is already sophisticated here, even at this early period. He knows how to vary the iambic line to bring out all its most subtle variations of rhythm. He was especially fond of and good at trochaic inversion, that is, reversing the stresses, in particular at the beginning of a line, to give the pattern bum, ba, ba, bum, instead of the iambic pattern ba, bum, ba, bum. The technical term, by the way, for the bum, ba, ba, bum pattern is a choriamb. Some examples are aiming behind, drops what he holds, find it too short. And you can hear the inversion of the first foot there. It's not aiming behind, it's aiming behind, drops what he holds, find it too short. Formally then, Uriconium and Ode reveals an Owen who is already fully proficient in constructing complex patterns of meter and rhyme and in handling them fluently. I see this poem as a clear forerunner of Wilfred's much greater ode, Insensibility, with its variable line length and intricate patterns of rhyme, or rather, in the case of Insensibility, para-rhyme. Wilfred could not yet, in 1913, have written Insensibility, but equally, he could not have written Insensibility in late 1917 and 1918 without having cut his teeth, so to speak, on Uriconium. So much for form. Let's now look at the poem's content. Next image, please. Thank you. The opening lines set the tone for the entire poem, presenting the destruction of Roman civilization in Britain as a sin and a wrong done to earlier inhabitants by a rabble. Throughout the poem, Owen clearly assumes that the city was sacked and burned suddenly by Saxon attackers, as Fox's guidebook said it was. The speaker of the ode is depicted as a modern visitor who observes the Roman city from the distance of 1,500 years, yet also displays an intimate acquaintance not just with the ruins of the city as they are today, but with its life and people during its prime. As part of this conception, the idea that all is as was, you see there in line 14, is central. The speaker claims that the excavated city is preserved exactly as it was, like a mummy, and Wilfred would, of course, have seen mummies in the British Museum. This cannot withstand much scrutiny. In fact, Fox's guidebook makes it quite clear that the ruins were highly degraded and that most of the city remained unexcavated. The artifacts that Owen so admired and describes in such vivid detail here were, of course, in museum cases, not visible through the riven ground, nor waiting in their original sites along the streets for the visitor to encounter. But Wilfred is so deeply invested in seeing Uriconium as analogous to Pompeii, preserved in a cataclysmic moment and frozen in time, that he presents it as a place that where all is as was, which one can say with some truth of Pompeii and Herculaneum. At the same time, the ode does recognize the process of spoliation and the reuse of various artifacts for new purposes throughout the centuries. The pivot is the exhortation in line 72 to, quote, mark well that Gaulish brooch, as a retort to the idea that modern art owes nothing to the past. From claiming that ancient art influences modern forms in the line, art's fairest buds on antique stem are graft, the speaker turns to ancient art that has been repurposed for modern uses. And by the way, I think that line I just read, art's fairest buds on antique stem or graft, is a line whose importance for Wilfred's whole view of poetry, what a poet's training should be, and the process of poetic creation can hardly be overstated. But in the ode, he uses that line to turn to ancient art that has been repurposed for modern uses and mentions various items in modern Wroxeter that are fragments from ancient Uriconium, a base for an anvil, Roman columns in a garden, and the church's font. Next image, please. There you see on the left the font from St. Andrew's, Wroxeter, which is, as the poem says, a hollowed out segment of a Roman column, as interestingly is the font in Shrewsbury Abbey, and that column is also from Uriconium, although Wilfred does not mention it. White's book that I mentioned earlier reproduces photographs of several other reused Roman elements throughout Wroxeter. The poem takes these spoliated fragments as a metaphor for cultural influence, a point reiterated in the final stanza, Rome hath left us more than walls and words, and better yet shall leave. And the entire poem expresses his remarkable feeling for the remote past. No less remarkable is his ability to evoke for his reader both how long a time has passed since the destruction of Uriconium, but also how contemporary its people seem, to evoke the presence of the past in the present, if I may put it that way. These points are particularly noteworthy in that crucial central fifth stanza. Next image, please. Here in this stanza, I am especially struck by the sensual details. The artifacts Owen lists here probably reflect exhibits he had actually seen in the on-site museum and the Shrewsbury Museum, but he imaginatively transfers these items back to the site itself, and in doing so, he invites us to see the city as it was, as though it were still living, or rather as though, again, like Pompeii, its inhabitants had been unfrozen in a moment of time by a catastrophe they had no time to escape, so that they dropped whatever they were holding or doing and tried to flee. The abandoned banquet is vividly present to our imagination with its oysters, marrow bones, and grapes. The Samian jar's beauty is recreated for us by sheen and flawless shape. There is something haunting about the image of Roman finger marks still visible in plaster. And most of all, there is the focus on the sense of touch in bracelets that from the warm Italian arm might seem to be scarce cold. The words, the warm Italian arm, foreground the actuality of the human body in all its corporeality, and I think remind us of futility with its sides still warm, full nerved. Owen is already here showing extraordinary skill at bringing the specific moment vividly before our eyes in all its lived particularity through one carefully observed physical detail. And he is already focusing on the transitoriness and pathos of human life. This bracelet was once on an arm that was warm and alive. It was once worn by a woman who was far from her home, an Italian in northern England, and warm in effect modifies Italian as well as arm, summoning up in just those three words the experience of someone who lived and presumably died far from home, still keeping the cultural artifacts of her native land. Is this too much to read into so short a phrase? Possibly, but I think not. It is precisely this sort of minutely observed detail that gives so many of Wilfred Owen's poems so much of their power. Think of the eyeballs huge bulged like squids of the century, or whose world is but the trembling of a flare in Apologia, or in Maundy Thursday's description of worshippers kissing a crucifix with the final line, I kissed the warm live hand that held the thing. In all of those and others, Owen invests one small detail with a great deal of weight and power so that it conveys much more than it actually says. And I would put the warm Italian arm in that category as well. John Stallworthy calls the Ode to Uriconium Owen's first war poem, and there is a great deal to be said for that. Obviously, the horrors of war and its human cost certainly engaged Wilfred's interest here. The fact that modern archaeologists think the destruction of Uriconium was not violent or sudden is irrelevant, since Wilfred is reacting to what he thought had happened there. The connection he makes with Pompeii is again important, a city suddenly and violently destroyed in a cataclysm, which allows us to see the inhabitants' everyday life interrupted, stopped at one moment of normal activity, never to resume. In my view, This is also Wilfred Owen's first underworld poem. The theme of a journey to the underworld would become extremely important in his war poems, most notably, of course, in Strange Meeting, but also in Mental Cases, The Sentry, the last stanza of Spring Offensive, Exposure, Apologia, and others. This ode shows that Wilfred was already attracted by the narrative of an individual who descends to the underworld and returns with a message for the living, long before he ever encountered the underworld trenches and tunnels of the Western Front. The crucial lines occur in the first stanza. If thou hast ever longed to lift the gloomy curtain of time past and spy the secret things that Hades hath, here, through this riven ground, take such a view. The excavated ruins of Uriconium are not only depicted as revealing the material lives of the Romans who inhabited the cities, simultaneously they are described as offering an actual glimpse into the secrets of Hades, when the speaker invites the reader to look through this riven ground. Next image, please. As the image from the 1859 excavation shows, the excavated level was, in fact, well below the level of the modern ground, so that a visitor approaching the excavation would quite literally be looking down through riven ground. And you can just see at the back of that picture a walkway with a little iron handrail along it, by which the visitors would walk down from the level of the old work into the excavation level. Owen is here taking the role of Virgil to Dante, showing the uncomprehending visitor through the underworld, but he is also casting himself in the role of the living man, Dante again, but also Odysseus and Aeneas, who returns from his journey to the underworld to recount what he has seen. This is especially clear in the lines where the speaker refers to his experience of walking through the city's streets as a godly privilege that is almost a sacrilege. He presents his presence in the excavated streets as a unique experience that marks him out from others and which he therefore must convey to others. There is no hint here that anyone who cared to do so could pay the entrance fee and walk through thy old streets as readily as the poem speaker did. It's fascinating to compare this with Harold Owen's description of the teenaged Wilfred acting as a guide for tourists visiting the site. The idea of describing the secret things that Hades hath to less aware visitors had some grounding in Wilfred's actual experiences. This presentation of the poem's speaker as the guide who reveals hidden things ties the ode directly to Wilfred's most important war poems, not just the underworld poems, but others as well, where he positions himself as a guide or a teacher, showing the uncomprehending reader the true nature of what has happened. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace and watch the wide eyes writhing in his face, if you could hear at every jolt the blood, unless you share with them in hell the sorrowful dark of hell, you shall not hear their mirth. And even, I try not to remember these things now, let dread hark back for one word only. Here in Uriconium, an ode, we see Wilfred groping for the first time towards his later statement that all a poet can do today is warn. Uriconium warns the reader against overlooking too easily or forgetting too completely the past cultures and past sufferings that have laid the groundwork for modern society, and also warns us against thinking that our own cultures are stable and invulnerable. Wilfred could not have foreseen in 1913 how pertinent to his own life that sense of ephemerality and of vulnerability to sudden cataclysm would become, but this early ode shows us how his feeling for pity, compassion, and the loss of gentle and tender human things had begun to develop even before his personal war experiences focused and refined it. It is sometimes said that it was the war that made Wilfred Owen a poet, awakened his sense of compassion. This ode and the also too often overlooked early poem, Deep Under Turfy Grass, show us that, on the contrary, the poet that Wilfred Owen would become was already there in developing form in his earlier writings. The war gave him his great and terrible subject, and out of it he crafted some of the finest poems of the English language, but the war did not create his poethood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'll stop sharing. Yes, I'm sure everyone is we can see everyone now clapping. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And around a poem that I've always thought was a neglected poem. And thank you for picking out all the kind of nuances that were happening in that.
Oh, and
And
there are so many more that I didn't have time to talk
there's
about.
so many more. Yeah, there's so many more. But perhaps I can open it out for questions, and maybe you can address some of those that haven't yet come up. So if anyone would like to maybe raise their hand or use the hand function or just unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be fine.
Nobody? Nothing?
Anyone? Okay, so I see Paul Norgate first, maybe Paul.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Do you think that is 1913? How far back do you think it goes? I mean, I'm wondering how much he'd worked on it before we get to those last drafts.
There's no way to know, of
No.
course. I don't think in its final form, I think it is 1913. It is so beautifully written, so well handled, that I don't see him writing it at the age of 16 or 17. I mean, he was a genius, but he was perhaps not quite that much of a genius. So I think 1913, when he was 20, is definitely the time period of the ode as we have it. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if he had started drafting it, had started working on it. I meant to look at Stallworthy's edition and see what manuscripts we have of this. And I'm sorry to say, in the flurry of writing the talk, I forgot to do that. But I don't think that we have earlier drafts of it. And I think there's just no way to tell. I wouldn't get all surprised if after his very first visit, and what did I say it was, 1909, if he started jotting, or 1909, if he started jotting things down. But I think this poem is too polished to be a truly early work.
A lot depends on whether Stallworthy is accurate with his papers.
Well, yes, it does. It
all,
does.
all the surviving ones are on the same kind of paper. That there's more than one draft or more than one version, I think. They're all on the same paper. And John says that he used the same paper for other work which have dates or have clues attached to them which suggest it's 1913. I just wonder, because 1913 was not a happy year for him, one way or another. I mean, he came back from Dunsdon pretty well flattened, and then was ill, and then failed again.
His exam, yes.
And I just wondered whether it sounds a bit more confident to me somehow than he might have done in 13.
So you're thinking it's later?
No, I was thinking 11, 12.
It's possible. It's possible. Like you say, a great deal depends on the accuracy of Stallworthy's dating of the papers. And I know that has been called into question. And of course, there's also always the awkward fact that one can buy a sheaf of paper, put it in a drawer, and use it again 5 years later. Now, that would argue for a later dating, not an earlier one. But I have notebooks that I wrote something in 2014, find them in the back of my closet and think, oh, there's a lot of unused paper in this, and so use them again. So 11, 12 is possible. It's possible.
I would agree that, I think what happens during the war years confuses things, because obviously he's moving around and he's involved in other things, and he does tend to use the same paper in a concentrated period. But that doesn't presuppose that he did the same all the way through. And I just
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. That's true. And there's no reason to think he bought one sheaf of paper, used it up to the last sheet, and only then went out and bought more paper. He could have had all sorts of different bits of paper from different times sitting around his room at home, of course. I think I would say, though, Paul, that the idea that he revisited the site in the summer of 1913, saw archaeologists working there, so more of it was opened up than had been visible to him before, all of that. I think that argues at least for polishing it in 1913, although perhaps not for completing it or for writing the whole thing in 1913. In 1911-12, he wanted to have had an opportunity to visit Uriconium, so far as we know. There's nothing that says he can't have written this sitting in his room in France, in Dunstan rather, just thinking about it. Certainly he could have, but I find rather compelling the idea that he revisited, that he saw what the modern archaeologists were doing, and that he is, in a way, after seeing those two young Oxford scholars, he is in a way trying to reclaim his own authority over the site by saying, all right, you're digging it up, but this is what it means. But we don't know.
I think, sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but I think that's a very helpful point that, I mean, the work that Jane and I are doing, it does demonstrate that right through to the end, he will revisit poems prompted by something. I mean, you quoted Dulce Decorum Est. Well, he goes back to that in July 1918 after he's on another gas course. And something prompts him to go back and revisit it. And that seems to be a habit of his. That
yes,
he will
it does. It's sort of
again. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other points?
Yeah. There's someone called LPH3.
Yes, more apologies. I forgot to change it for my work thing. It's I'm
okay.
Lorna Hardwick.
Hi.
Sorry about that. Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for opening up the poem and making me think of all sorts of things I had never noticed in it before. The point I wanted to raise and perhaps ask you to say something about was this relationship between a material culture, including interestingly objects in this case, and the poetics of place. I mean, we're very used, for instance, to thinking in terms of the poetics of place as opening the way to almost a kind of nostalgia, you know, a landscape of the mind, you know, the kind of thing that we get in relation to that particular geographical area in the poems of A.E. Housman, for instance. Where Housman also invokes an imagined reconstruction of what people were and how they behaved and what they did and so on. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because you talk very interestingly about Owen's actual experience of the site, but also of the way in which, if it's not too Wordsworthian, it was also perhaps emotion recollected in tranquility when he was somewhere else. And I was wondering if you could say something about the extent to which the poem does give us perhaps an insight into certain kinds of nostalgia and the sense in which place becomes a sort of imaginative dynamic that actually interacts with the very specific discussion of material culture and objects and so on.
Right. I think that is without question a strong aspect, not just of this poem, but of Owen's work in general. But to start with this poem, he is talking about the place as it is visible now, the ruins, but he's also referring throughout the poem, I don't want to take the time to go through and look for the particular lines, but he talks about the farmer in a field. He says, who pauses here? Who thinks about any of this? So he's reflecting, how shall I put it? A multi-layered nostalgia of place. You can go and look at the place as it is now, and that's part of why I wanted to show the pictures of Silchester, to show that you can have a place now that if you didn't know there was a Roman city under that field with the handsome cow in it, you wouldn't know that there was a Roman city. The place as you see it today hides, buries, covers everything that was there before. And my impression about Wilfred, even as a teenager, is that he was acutely aware of that in a way that most people aren't. that he was constantly thinking of what this place had been before as in conjunction with what it is now. And I think the comparison to Houseman is a very good one there, because of course the title of the book I mentioned, Ashes Under Uricon, is a quotation from Houseman. The same kind of thing, looking at the modern site and thinking of what it was before and what happened to change it to what it is now. There's a kind of complex nostalgia going on there, if nostalgia is quite the right word. In some of Wilfred's war poems, I'm thinking particularly of the opening of Spring Offensive, where he gives such a remarkable scene painting, for lack of a better way to describe it, of the meadow that they're in, the humming insects, the beautiful meadow grasses, the flowers, the buttercups that blessed with gold, their slow boots coming up, all of it intensely focused on what classical authors would call a locus homoeus, a beautiful place, a pastoral, summed up in the image of a place. And then, of course, in Spring Offensive, that shifts immediately to the soldiers going over the ridge into hell, literally and figuratively. And I think there is a similar kind of dynamic. Sorry, I'm sort of rambling, but I think there's a similar kind of dynamic there of looking at the place as it is and seeing through that to the place as it was or even as it will be. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think it's a very open-ended issue, isn't it? That probably one could come at it a number of different ways. I mean, I was very interested in when you used a sort of palimpsestic model of the way in which you're doing taking up. Probably the mummy, I suppose, would be the central image.
Right. Yes. That the city is preserved as a mummy would be. Let me see, where is that? I don't see it right now, but something about how the city is as though its face were covered with a mummy cloth.
That's right. It's line
end of the first stanza.
Wrap the dead
In
city's
the first
face
stanza,
like
you're right. Of course, wrap the dead city's face like
is
mummy.
as was, except for worm and moth.
Worm and moth. But that is contradicted, I think, by the central stanza that I spent the most time on, where he is just almost interacting with those people. I mean, they're not there, but here's their banquet. Look what they were eating. They had oysters, they had marrow bones, they had grapes. Here again, my favorite image, the bracelets from the warm Italian arm scarce cold. That's not a mummified city.
No.
That's directly, and I think that's where the underworld imagery comes in. That's directly taking us in to interact with. They don't speak back to us, obviously, but to interact with the people who are there. So he's using these two different kinds of approaches to the past. The mummy, what's another word for mummy? The frozen, mummified image that isn't still in any way dynamic. And then the walking through the streets. And perhaps that's what he means by calling it a privilege and almost a sacrilege, that he is approaching these people in a way that normally we don't. Normally we look at them as in a case in a museum, even a mummy, even an actual dead human body in a case in a museum. Here he's approaching them in a way that allows him more interaction with them, but still is all through the remote past, looking into the riven ground, looking into the secret things of Hades. It's very, very complicated.
Yeah, it is. That's very interesting. Thank you. I mean, I suppose the only other thing I just wanted to drop into the discussion was it's difficult not to be sidetracked by modern archaeology's interpretation of the site. But it is really interesting, isn't it, that he is thinking of civilizations as changing through violence and in quite a sudden manner, rather than through general decline and decay and
right. That's right. Yeah. I think now I am not an historian of Roman Britain. I'm not an archaeologist. I know much less about Roman Britain than I ought to know. But my impression is that there wasn't a cataclysm in the Roman towns of Britain, that Rome just left.
Yeah.
They just gave up and left, basically.
Yeah, I think
those-
the evidence, certainly from further south, around Corinium and so on, shows that the roads gradually decayed and the public services declined and the sewers didn't work as well as they had.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
weren't done, and et cetera, et cetera.
But over decades and even centuries, things just declined and decayed. And as I said in passing, as happens everywhere, in Italy, in France and Spain, everywhere, the bits of Roman buildings were taken and reused for other things. There's a Roman site in Italy called Pietra Abbondante, which means lots of rock. And I've always really liked that name, lots of stone, because it was spoliated. The stone was taken from it to build churches and walls and houses and all sorts of things. In Rome, people lived in and had shops in the substructures of the theaters of Pompey and of Marcellus, because there are these great, well-crafted, beautiful stone buildings. What can we use them for? So the bit that Wilfred notices about the font in the church is a column. The anvil rests on a Roman stone. I haven't been able to find a picture of that anvil, but it's perfectly reasonable that it would. And again, White's book shows that there are all sorts of bits and pieces, walls to people's gardens, planters with flowers in them in Wroxeter, all of which are taken from the site of Uriconium. So I think certainly in Britain, and to some extent elsewhere as well, it was a matter of gradual falling into decline rather than a cataclysmic destruction. But the cataclysmic destruction is so much more imaginatively satisfying.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's good.
And then the other thing was how unlikely it is that any of the locals in the time of Roman Britain were genuinely Italians from Rome.
Yeah, they probably.
That's another thing that just a little naive and on Owen's part.
Yes, yeah, and I should have brought that out. No, his imagining of the warm Italian arm. No, at that point, they were very unlikely to be Italians. In fact, they were probably largely intermarried with the local population. So yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Elizabeth, this point about slow decline as against sudden cataclysm, I think is an interesting one. I mean, it does seem to be important to Owen that the reason why the Romans are no longer here is that they were suddenly and violently and rudely ejected rather than imploding from within.
Imploding from within and intermarrying with the locals, so they are still there.
Indeed, yeah.
But
I mean, if you jump ahead to his sonnet 1914, I mean, clearly Rome is the high point. Blaze its glory out with Rome. And after that, everything is a sort of gradual decline.
Yes.
But Owen's notion is that Rome is the high spot, and what we are, we owe as much as to anybody to them.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. Yes.
Sophia.
Yeah,
please.
hi. So you mentioned that this one is his first like underworld poem, and obviously you've mentioned Deep Under Turfy Grass and Strange Meetings, but I was wondering if there are any of his like earlier poems that also have this theme.
Of his earlier poems?
Yeah.
Earlier than, I think not. Thinking about his poems that are earlier than 1913, I think this is the first time he ventures into the underworld, so to speak. Well, when did he start working on Perseus? Which doesn't exist, it's only fragments, but Jane...
Not the one that he wrote like with like 50 lines in it that he wrote in like one night or something. Sorry, I'm just
Yeah.
not familiar with his work because I'm only doing it at school. So
Right.
No,
right.
that's fine.
No, there's a
I
he
think
was
the
working on a
Perseus
long-
fragment.
Yeah, he was working on a long epic poem that he was going to call Perseus. And as Dominic Hibbard has said, it's one of the central important works in Owen's oeuvre, but it doesn't exist because he never, it's only little fragments here and there. But I'm trying to remember, Paul, do you know by any chance when he first started working on Perseus? Because
no idea.
I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't.
I don't either, sorry. It does, the fragments of it, the jottings for it do seem to include an underworld scene, which is bizarre in itself because Perseus is not one of the heroes who went to the underworld. But I just don't know if he had started working on that before he wrote this ode, assuming that this ode is indeed from 1913, which, as Paul has said, we can't even be sure of.
I'm pretty
But
sure
then-
Perseus is around 1910, 1911, but I could
I
be
think he
wrong.
starts on it then. He then later
Yeah.
goes to it, as Paul was saying, he revisits and revisits. He goes back to it and seemed to be at one point trying to turn it into a war poem or trying to connect the war with it. But it is so fragmentary, and we don't even necessarily know which fragments he conceived of as part of Perseus. Stallworthy's edition groups several together that seem to have something to do with Perseus. Hibbard thinks a few more probably are also connected with Perseus. But yeah, I think he did at least conceive the idea of it fairly early. But when he thought of adding an underworld sequence to that, or what he thought he would do with such a sequence, that's murky.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't very helpful. Sorry.
No, it was definitely.
Thank you for your question. Other questions?
No?
No, I
I've
feel
got
I
one
should.
more if Elizabeth wants to consider it.
Okay.
Sure.
There's one manuscript on which Owen has written against, I think it stanzas 6 and 7, omit.
Oh,
And I wonder, my own opinion would be that might probably make a better poem, except that it would get rid of the bit about the Italian arm. But the other stanza, which is where he gets very didactic about everybody should, you who laugh and think, what is it? Ye who laugh and living as if time meant but 12. That one could go without any worry at all, I think.
that one could go, I think. But
And
I
think that argues for him revisiting and looking and thinking, oh.
Yeah. I'm abashed that I did not look at the manuscripts. I had that in my mind yesterday evening. We went out for my birthday dinner, and when we got home, I forgot to look at the manuscript. Sorry about that.
I think you're allowed, Elizabeth.
It's fine.
But I'm sad to hear that he was thinking about omitting my favorite stanza, but there you have
Maybe
it.
he would have put it back in. You don't know.
You never know.
I think,
right.
and I think this is one of the things that's really fascinating about going back to the manuscripts, which Paul and I are finding in our work. But it actually just came up today. There was a talk at the Bodleian by Leslie Smith about her book Handwritten, which is one of the Bodleian publications. And she was talking about manuscripts. She did talk about actually looking at Owen. The Owen manuscripts in the Bodleian, which was nice to go up to her afterward and say, it's his birthday today, so that's perfect that you mentioned him. But she made the comment about the story that the manuscripts tell you, and that an edition doesn't get you close in the same way that actually looking at the manuscripts does. And that if it tells a completely different narrative, right, than what you see in a printed edition. And I think this idea that, the fact that he sort of writes omit is a testament to the way in which he was constantly working with what he had written.
Yes.
Nothing was perfect. He didn't just throw this out on the page and emote it. He worked it, and it still wasn't, we don't really know at the end exactly what was a finished poem, except for the ones that he published in his lifetime. And even then, we don't know whether he would have revisited them.
He might have revisited them. And of course, as I think I said when we were doing the 1921 edition, when I talked about Duca et decorum est, then it is sort of staggering to realize, as you and Paul both know, that poem is very clearly unfinished. He had not decided what to do with that central line that shows up in the standard version as tired, outstripped 5 nines that drop behind. He hadn't yet settled on a reading for that. So perhaps one of his most famous poems, one of the most famous poems of the 20th century, isn't finished.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or-
By the way, this is sort of a side note, but it often occurs to me how terrible for modern literary historians it will be that we don't keep manuscripts anymore.
Mm.
You know, and this
Yeah.
book I just finished on Richard Aldington, I don't have piles of revised manuscripts because I did it all on the computer. And
Mm.
so when I make the changes, the earlier version is gone.
Mm.
So it doesn't matter with me because I'm not a great author, but with poets or novelists,
Yeah.
the fact that we will no longer in the future be able to go back and look and see, he revised that phrase, or, oh, there was this paragraph here that he chose to leave out. We won't have that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Except for the ones that, save different files and do keep it. So it just depends. But yeah,
right.
it is a completely different discipline of writing, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As is the fact that we won't have letters anymore. Just
Well, I
imagine,
think the letters are more important.
yeah,
That's
just imagine if Wilfred had texted to Susan rather than writing her.
Exactly. Well, we know he didn't keep his letters,
No, he didn't.
so I think that's the
We were
thing.
talking
It's
about
like,
that this morning, that he didn't keep his letters, as I think so many soldiers didn't, because where would you keep them?
exactly.
Yeah.
And I was constantly thinking about, when I was doing the edition, was, and Dominic brings this up in his book, somewhere in somebody's attic there might be some letters from Owen,
Yeah.
because he would have written to more people than his mother. He had
Absolutely, of
people that
course.
he would have written to, but those people wouldn't necessarily have kept the letters unless they were family. Because
Right.
who was he at the time?
I said that to David this morning. I said they didn't know he was going to be Wilfred Owen.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
There was a girlfriend whose letters he did who were destroyed by her.
That's true. Mrs. Fullerton, that is true. We
And
know that.
Sassoon destroyed several of his letters.
Yeah.
Sassoon's somewhere, I forget where, but
Yeah.
Sassoon destroyed several of Owen's letters that were too personal, too private. So we
Yes,
would
but was
love
that
to know what he said in
did
those,
that-
but we never will. Yeah.
But did he not do that just because Harold Owen pressured him to?
Sorry?
Did he not do that only because Harold Owen pressured him to? He was going to show them to Harold eventually, but then once Harold turned up, he just threw them all in the fire. I think that's why I read somewhere. I can't remember where.
I don't know where I've not heard that story. I know that he'd written to Harold to say that he had gotten rid of some that he said were embarrassing to me, the way, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was more that, he was really being so overwhelming to me.
Yeah, and also what's more is in his biography, right, Dominic Hibbert says that Harold Owen actually thanked Sassoon for destroying them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which
Very
is
likely, yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I just read that letter from Sassoon to Harold last spring when I was going through the archive, and I can't remember either, Jane, precisely what he said, but I know Harold asked Sassoon, do you have any letters from my brother?
Mm-hmm.
And Sassoon said, I have some, but what I don't remember is whether he implied I had a lot more and I destroyed them because you were breathing down my neck.
No, I don't think that was the
already-
reason. No, I don't think that was the reason.
I think he just thought they were too private.
Yeah.
And we can speculate about what that means all we like, but Sassoon just didn't want anyone else reading them.
Mhm.
And we can see from the letters to Sassoon that do survive that Wilfred was capable of being extraordinarily emotional in writing to Sassoon. And maybe some of them were just too much of that, who knows?
Mm.
But yeah, we don't have the correspondence to Wilfred, which would be really helpful in many ways. I would love to have Leslie Gunston's letters to Wilfred, as well as Wilfred's letters to Leslie Gunston, but we don't, unless, as Dominic Hibbert said, they're sitting in a trunk in an attic somewhere.
Somewhere, yes. Well, we'll keep looking. Well, I realize we're coming up to 9 o'clock. I just want to ask everyone to please thank Elizabeth Vandiver again for an absolutely amazing talk and explication of Uriconium and everything. So thank you so much, Elizabeth.